Callum was 39 years old, earned a salary of $310,000 a year as a vascular surgeon at Mass General Brigham, and on Thanksgiving Day, at precisely 4 o'clock in the afternoon, his 2-year marriage detonated in the middle of his in-laws' formal dining room. He had spent the last 14 years of his life mastering the intricate vascular systems of the human body, learning to suture arteries finer than a thread with a hand that never trembled. He could repair an aortic aneurysm in the dead of night with calm precision, but he had failed to see the rot spreading through the heart of his own home. The life he had meticulously built, a life of quiet accomplishment and hard-won stability, was about to be exposed as a hollow facade, and it would happen over a 22-pound turkey he was just about to carve. He had no idea, standing there in his perfectly pressed $700 Canali trousers and a crisp white shirt, that in less than an hour, the carefully constructed world he shared with his wife Ione would shatter so completely that the only thing left to do would be to calmly finish his dinner. He didn't know that the whispers he'd been ignoring for 6 months were about to become a full-throated scream. He thought this was just another tense holiday dinner in the heart of Beacon Hill, a performance of familial bliss in his in-laws' $12 million townhouse. He was wrong. The devastating situation wasn't coming. It was already there, sitting at the table with them, an invisible guest waiting for its cue. And when it arrived, it wouldn't knock politely, it would kick the door in. But what Callum did have, a fact that would soon become his salvation, was a premarital Lewisburg Square townhouse purchased with his own money, a portfolio of retirement accounts worth $1.1 million that predated his marriage certificate, and a core of unshakable discipline forged in the crucible of a surgical residency. Ione and her family had always underestimated that discipline. They mistook his quiet nature for weakness and his focus for a lack of awareness. They were about to learn, in the most public and humiliating way possible, just how observant a quiet man can be. They had no idea what was coming. Do you know someone who has been underestimated like Callum? We see stories like this all the time, where a person's quiet strength is their greatest weapon. Let us know in the comments if you've ever seen someone turn the tables when everyone counted them out. The facade of their life was as beautiful and as fragile as the antique porcelain Ione's mother collected. It lived in Callum's $3.2 million townhouse on Lewisburg Square, a historic, gas-lit enclave of quiet wealth that felt a world away from the chaotic energy of the hospital. He had bought the house a year before he even met Ione, a monument to his own success, paid for with a decade of grueling hours and sleepless nights. Its brick facade and black shutters were a symbol of permanence, of something real he had built with his own 2 hands. After their wedding, Ione had moved in and promptly redecorated. His comfortable, lived-in study with its worn leather chairs was transformed into what she called a receiving room, a sterile space of white couches and abstract art that cost him over $30,000. She said it was more appropriate for their station. Callum, exhausted from a 70-hour work week, hadn't argued. He just wanted peace. A typical Tuesday evening would find him arriving home at 9:15 p.m., the scent of antiseptic still clinging to his clothes. The townhouse would be silent. He'd find Ione in their master bedroom, scrolling through her phone, the blue light illuminating her flawless, deep brown skin. Her natural hair, which she wore in elegant, intricate twists, would be perfectly coiffed. She was a stunning woman, and she knew it. "How was your day?" he'd ask, loosening the $150 silk tie from around his neck. "Fine," she would reply, her eyes never leaving the screen. "Blythe and I had lunch at the Contessa. You should have seen the bill. $180 for 2 salads and some water. Ridiculous." She would say it with a little laugh, as if the expense were a charming anecdote rather than a real transaction funded by the very work that kept him from such leisurely lunches. He would look at the new $4,000 Chanel bag sitting on the chaise lounge, a casual acquisition from an afternoon shopping trip on Newbury Street, and feel a familiar, weary pang. Ione didn't work. She had a degree in art history from Wellesley, but had never held a job for more than a few months. Her life was a curated series of social engagements, charity committees, and personal maintenance, all underwritten by a combination of her parents' immense wealth and Callum's substantial income. Callum paid the $14,000 monthly mortgage on the townhouse he already owned. He paid the utilities, the property taxes, the $900 a month lease on her white BMW 4 Series, and the staggering credit card bills that arrived each month like a recurring injury. He told himself it was the price of admission. He, a black man who had clawed his way up from a working-class family in Roxbury, had married into one of Boston's most prominent black families. Her father, Harold Maxwell, was a senior partner at a prestigious law firm on State Street. Her mother, Blythe, was a doyen of Beacon Hill society. They had accepted him, or so he thought, impressed by his career at Mass General. They loved having a brilliant surgeon in the family. It was another accessory, like their season tickets to the Boston Symphony or their summer home on Martha's Vineyard. The week of Thanksgiving, the tension in the house was thick enough to palpate. Ione was irritable, snapping at him for leaving his $89 Timex watch on the kitchen counter. "Callum, this is a crate and barrel countertop, not your locker at the hospital. Can you please have some respect for our things?" My things, he thought but didn't say. He just picked up the watch and slid it into his pocket. She was planning their attendance at her parents' dinner with the intensity of a military campaign. "I've picked out your suit," she announced on Wednesday morning, holding up a dark navy Xenia suit that had cost him $3,200. "And for God's sake, try to talk about something other than medicine. No one wants to hear about varicose veins over their pumpkin pie." He looked at her, at the beautiful stranger he shared a bed with. "It's vascular surgery, Ione, and it's my life's work." She sighed, a dramatic, put-upon sound. "I know, darling, it's just, you can be a bit much. Try to fit in for me?" He nodded, the weariness settling deep in his bones. He loved her, or at least he loved the woman he thought he had married, but that woman was becoming harder and harder to find. She was buried under layers of designer clothes, condescension, and a strange, new distance he couldn't quite name. He felt a profound sense of loneliness in his own magnificent home, surrounded by expensive objects that meant nothing to him. The normalcy was a performance, and the applause was costing him his soul. He had no idea the final act was just a day away. The betrayal didn't begin with a bang. It began 6 months earlier with a whisper, a name spoken too casually on a warm evening in May. Callum had just come home from a marathon surgery, a complex carotid endarterectomy that had saved a man from a massive stroke. He was bone-tired, but filled with the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. He found Ione on their small, brick-paved patio, sipping a glass of rosé that probably cost $50 a bottle. "I ran into Malachi today," she said, swirling the pale pink liquid in her glass, "at the Starbucks on Charles Street. Can you believe it?" Callum froze. Malachi. He hadn't heard that name in years. He was Ione's college boyfriend, a charismatic, handsome, artist type from a background far different from her own. Their relationship had been a passionate, tumultuous affair that her parents had vehemently disapproved of and eventually crushed. "Oh," Callum said, keeping his voice neutral. "How is he?" "He's the same," she said, a strange, wistful smile playing on her lips. "Still trying to make it as a musician. Still ridiculously charming." She laughed, a light, airy sound that didn't reach her eyes. It was just so random. But it didn't feel random to Callum. It felt like a stone dropped into a still pond, the ripples spreading outwards in ways he couldn't yet see. That night, he lay in their king-sized bed, listening to the sound of her breathing, and felt the first real seed of suspicion take root. Over the next few weeks, the signs accumulated like dust in an unused room. She was on her phone constantly, her fingers flying across the screen. When he entered a room, she would quickly lock the screen or flip the phone over. Once, he glanced over her shoulder and saw Malachi's name flash in a text notification before she angled the phone away. "Who was that?" he asked, his tone as casual as he could manage. "Just my sister," she lied, not missing a beat. Then she turned on him, her voice sharp. "Honestly, Callum, you're so insecure sometimes. Is it because you work those ridiculous hours? You're so wrapped up in your own world, you get paranoid about mine?" It was a masterful deflection, turning his concern into a character flaw. He backed down, ashamed. Maybe she was right. Maybe the long hours and the life and death stress were making him possessive. But the unease lingered. Her spending, always extravagant, escalated. There was a solo weekend trip to the Miraval Berkshires Resort and Spa that appeared as a $4,800 charge on his American Express. She said she went with girlfriends, but when he later ran into one of those friends, she mentioned she hadn't seen Ione in weeks. Ione brushed it off. "Oh, it was a different group. You don't know them." More lies, layered one on top of the other. She bought a $2,400 Burberry trench coat she didn't need and a pair of $200 Jimmy Choo heels for a gala she claimed to be attending. The cruelty became more frequent, more pointed. She began to belittle his work, the very thing that funded her lifestyle. One evening, he was recounting a particularly difficult case, the voice of a grateful patient's daughter still echoing in his ears. "And she said I gave her father back to her," he finished. A rare moment of vulnerability for him. Ione looked up from a catalog for a high-end furniture store. "That's nice, dear," she said, her tone dismissive. "Did you remember to call the plumber about the guest bathroom sink? It's been dripping for a week. It's hard to have people over when the house is falling apart." The comment landed like a slap. His life-saving work reduced to a lesser priority than a dripping faucet. The house wasn't falling apart. She was. The outrage, hot and sharp, began to accumulate in his chest, a pressure building behind a dam of weary resignation. He started sleeping in the guest room, telling her he didn't want to wake her with his early morning alarms for the hospital. It was a lie. He just couldn't stand the proximity to her dishonesty. The breaking point, the moment his passive suspicion turned into cold, active certainty, came on a Friday night in late October. Ione was dressed to the nines in a shimmering, backless 1900 gown. "I'm off to the museum's fundraising gala," she said, kissing the air near his cheek. "Don't wait up." Hours later, at 11:37 p.m., a gnawing anxiety he couldn't shake propelled him to his laptop. Years ago, in a moment of feigned concern, Ione had insisted they share their locations via the Find My app. "For safety, baby," she'd said, "in case something happens." He had never once used it. He had felt it was an invasion of privacy. But tonight, privacy felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. He opened the application. His heart hammered against his ribs. The map loaded. Her icon, a small circle with her initials, was not at the Museum of Fine Arts in the Fenway-Kenmore neighborhood. It was miles away, pinging from a small, crowded bar in Dorchester, a place of cheap beer and loud music, a place she would never go. A place he knew with sickening certainty that was 2 blocks from the apartment Malachi used to live in. He didn't call her. He didn't text. He simply stared at the screen, the dam of his denial finally breaking. A cold, terrifying calm washed over him. He took a screenshot of the map, the timestamp clearly visible in the corner of the screen. Then, with a methodical click of the mouse, he explored the features of their shared family account. He found a log, a simple metadata record of communications linked to her phone number. He didn't need to read the words. The numbers told the whole story. 47 text messages exchanged with Malachi's number in the past week alone. 183 in the last month. He took another screenshot, and another. He documented everything. The cold fury of a surgeon excising a tumor now directed at his own life. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a data point. It was evidence. He saved the files to a secure folder on his desktop, labeled simply Exhibit A. When she came home at 2:14 a.m., smelling of perfume and a lie, he was sitting in the dark of his study. "Hey," she said, startled to see him up. "The gala ran late. It was so boring." He looked at her, at the beautiful, intricate web of deceit she had woven. He felt nothing. The love had been carved out of him, leaving a clean, sterile void. "I'm glad you're home safe," he said, his voice perfectly even. He had made a critical mistake, not in trusting her, but in underestimating his own capacity for strategic restraint. The performance wasn't over. He just had to play his part for one more month, one more holiday. He had no idea how thoroughly she was about to help him make his case. Thanksgiving Day dawned cold and gray over Boston, the sky a uniform sheet of slate that promised a miserable, drizzling rain. The weather was a perfect match for Callum's mood. As he stood in their bedroom, fastening the buttons on a crisp white dress shirt, he felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he were watching a movie of his own life. Ione was humming in the bathroom, a cheerful, carefree sound that grated on his nerves. She was excited. Thanksgiving at her parents' home was the pinnacle of her social calendar, a chance to be the perfect daughter in the perfect setting. "Do you think this necklace is too much?" she asked, emerging from the bathroom. She was wearing a deep crimson dress that hugged her figure, her elegant twists piled high on her head. Around her neck was a diamond pendant he'd bought her for their first anniversary, a $7,500 token of a love he now realized had only ever flowed in one direction. "It looks beautiful," he said, his voice flat. He picked up his navy Xenia suit jacket, the one she'd picked out for him, and slipped it on. It felt like a costume. The drive to Beacon Hill was thick with an unspoken tension. Ione chattered about her mother's new caterer and the seating chart, while Callum stared out at the rain-slicked streets of Boston, his mind a million miles away. He was thinking of the screenshots saved on his laptop, the digital proof of his wife's secret life. They arrived at the Maxwell's townhouse at 2 p.m. It was a magnificent 4-story brick edifice on Mount Vernon Street, a home that broadcasted generations of wealth and influence. The door was opened by a housekeeper in a black and white uniform, and they were enveloped by the scent of roasting turkey, pine boughs, and old money. Blythe Maxwell, Ione's mother, greeted them with air kisses. She was a tall, slender woman with skin the color of warm honey, her straightened hair perfectly coiffed. She was wearing a cream-colored cashmere dress that likely cost more than Callum's first car. "Darling, you're here, and Callum, you look well-rested for a change." It was a backhanded compliment, a subtle dig at his demanding career. Harold, her father, was holding court in the living room, a cavernous space with 12-foot ceilings, a marble fireplace, and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors. He was a large, imposing man with a booming voice and an air of unshakable self-importance. He shook Callum's hand with a grip that was meant to be powerful but felt merely performative. "Callum, good of you to get away from the hospital. Still saving the city's unfortunates, are we?" "Something like that, Harold," Callum replied, his jaw tight. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in passive aggression. The conversation was a minefield of thinly veiled insults, and condescending questions about Callum's work and background. Blythe lamented how Ione had to spend so many evenings alone. Harold made a joke about surgeons having a god complex. Callum endured it all with a placid expression, contributing little, observing everything. He felt like an anthropologist studying a strange, alien tribe. He watched Ione, saw how she basked in her parents' attention, laughing at their jokes, seamlessly slipping back into the role of the indulged princess. She barely looked at him. At precisely 3:58 p.m., the housekeeper announced that dinner was served. They moved into the dining room, a space dominated by a long mahogany table set for 12, though there were only the four of them. The table was laden with a staggering amount of food, all served in heavy, ornate silver dishes. A magnificent 22-pound turkey, burnished to a perfect golden brown, sat on an $800 silver platter at the head of the table, waiting for Callum to perform his one designated role, the man who carves the bird. Harold cleared his throat. Well, Callum, the moment of truth. Let's see if a surgeon's hands are as good with a turkey as they are with well, whatever it is you do. Callum picked up the heavy, ornate carving knife, a $450 Wusthof set that was clearly more for show than function. He was about to make the first cut when it happened. The doorbell rang, not a polite chime, but a series of frantic, insistent presses. Everyone froze. The housekeeper hurried to the front of the house. They heard the door open, followed by a man's raised, desperate voice. And then he was there, standing in the archway of the dining room. It was Malachi. He was gaunt, his eyes wild. He was wearing a rain-soaked denim jacket and his hair was a mess. He looked completely out of place in this temple of ordered wealth, a chaotic force of nature. His eyes locked on Ione. The clock on the mantelpiece began to chime the hour. It was 4 p.m. Ione! Malachi's voice cracked with emotion, echoing in the suddenly silent room. Don't do this. You can't. You said you were going to tell him today. You promised me. Come back to me. Every head turned to Ione. Her face, moments before flushed with social satisfaction, had gone a ghastly, ashen white. A choked, horrified sound escaped her lips. Blythe gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Harold's face went from ruddy to a deep, apoplectic purple. He half rose from his chair, sputtering, speechless. Callum did not move. He simply stood at the head of the table, the carving knife still in his hand, and watched the entire artifice of his marriage crumble into dust. Ione looked from Malachi's desperate face to Callum's terrifyingly blank one. Her eyes were wide with panic. She didn't say a word to her husband. She didn't try to explain. She just pushed her chair back so violently it nearly tipped over, and she ran. She ran out of the dining room, past her stunned parents, and out the front door after the man who had just destroyed her life. The slam of the heavy oak door echoed through the house like a gunshot. The silence that followed the slamming door was absolute. It was heavier than the antique silver on the table, more oppressive than the judgmental gaze of the painted ancestors on the walls. Harold Maxwell remained half standing, his mouth agape, his face a mottled shade of crimson. Blythe was frozen in her chair, her perfectly manicured hand still clutching the pearls at her throat, her eyes wide with a horror that was equal parts shock and social ruin. They both stared at Callum, their expressions a mixture of fear, embarrassment, and a desperate plea for him to do something, to yell, to scream, to chase after her, to give them a script for this unprecedented disaster. Callum did none of those things. He lowered his gaze from the empty archway where his wife had just been and looked down at the magnificent turkey. It sat there, glistening under the light of the crystal chandelier, an absurd monument to a celebration that had just died. He felt a strange, cold clarity descend upon him, the same focus he felt in the operating room when a patient's artery blew and chaos erupted around him. In chaos, you focus on the task at hand. The task at hand was carving the turkey. With a steady hand that betrayed none of the seismic shock that had just ripped through his life, he placed the tines of the $450 carving fork firmly into the breast of the bird. He raised the matching knife. The first slice was clean and precise, separating a perfect piece of white meat from the carcass. The only sound in the cavernous room was the soft shush of the blade moving through the tender flesh and the faint scrape as it touched the platter. He laid the first slice down. Then he made another cut, and another. Each movement was deliberate, economical, and unnervingly calm. He worked his way through the breast, laying out a neat fan of perfectly uniform slices. He was not just carving the turkey, he was dissecting the moment, asserting a terrifying control over a situation that had spun into utter madness. He was refusing to participate in their drama. Blythe finally found her voice, a strangled whisper. "Callum, what are you doing?" Callum didn't look up. He moved to the thigh, expertly locating the joint with the tip of his knife and separating it with a surgeon's precision. He placed the dark meat on the other side of the platter. "Harold," Blythe hissed, her voice trembling. "Do something." Harold sank back into his chair, looking utterly defeated. He was a man used to controlling every outcome, and he had no idea how to process this. His daughter had just publicly humiliated him, and his son-in-law was responding by preparing dinner. "Callum, for God's sake, man." Harold's voice was a hoarse croak. "Your wife just ran out of the house with another man." Callum paused his work. He placed the knife and fork down carefully on the platter, not making a sound. He turned his head and looked directly at Harold, his eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky. For the first time since the explosion, he spoke. "She is your daughter," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a final judgment. "And this is your house. But this," he gestured to the platter, "is a 22-pound turkey. It would be a shame to let it go to waste." Then he picked up a plate from the stack, one of Blythe's 300 per plate Bernardal porcelain settings. He placed 2 slices of white meat and one of dark meat onto it. He added a generous scoop of mashed potatoes, a spoonful of cornbread stuffing, and a ladle of gravy. He walked back to his seat at the table, sat down and unfolded his linen napkin. Placing it neatly in his lap, he picked up his fork and knife. He cut a small piece of turkey, dipped it in the mashed potatoes, and brought it to his mouth. He chewed slowly, his expression unreadable. He swallowed. Blythe let out a small, choked sob. The sight of him eating, of him performing this act of radical normalcy in the face of abject chaos, was more frightening than any outburst could have been. It was a declaration. It told them that as far as he was concerned, Ione was already gone. The marriage was over. He was simply having his last meal. He took another bite, and another. He ate with a slow, deliberate pace, a man with nowhere to be and nothing left to say. The Maxwells just watched, trapped in a tableau of their own making. Their perfect Thanksgiving was in ruins, their reputation was in tatters, and the man they had so casually disdained was sitting at the head of their table, silently and methodically eating their food, holding all the power in his devastating stillness. When he was finished, he wiped his mouth with the napkin, placed it beside his clean plate, and pushed his chair back. He stood up. "Thank you for dinner, Blythe, Harold," he said, his voice polite, formal, and utterly devoid of emotion. "It was excellent." He turned and walked out of the dining room, his footsteps echoing on the polished hardwood floors. He did not look back. He left them there, surrounded by the wreckage of their pride and a feast that would never be eaten. The strike was complete. It hadn't been loud or violent. It had been quiet, cold, and absolutely final. Have you ever witnessed a moment where silence was more powerful than shouting? That quiet strength can be the most intimidating response of all. Share your thoughts on Callum's reaction in the comments below. The cold November rain had started again, lashing against the windows of the Uber as it carried Callum away from Beacon Hill. He didn't go back to the townhouse on Louisburg Square. Not yet. He couldn't face the ghost of his marriage, the rooms filled with Ione's things, her perfume, the lingering echo of her lies. He directed the driver to the Marriott Long Wharf, a sterile, impersonal hotel overlooking the harbor. He paid the $47 fare in cash and checked into a corner room with a king-sized bed and a view of the dark, churning water. It cost him $589 for the night. It was worth every penny for the anonymity. He didn't turn on the television. He didn't call a friend. He simply sat in a chair by the window and watched the rain, letting the events of the afternoon wash over him. His phone, which he had placed on the nightstand, began to vibrate. It was Ione. He watched it buzz angrily for a moment before the screen went dark. A minute later, it buzzed again. Her father, Harold. He ignored that call too. Then came a text from Blythe. "Callum, we are worried sick. Please tell us where you are." He felt nothing. It was a strange and liberating sensation. The part of him that would have been gutted, enraged, or heartbroken seemed to have been surgically removed. All that remained was a cold, clear purpose. On Friday morning, after a night of deep, dreamless sleep, he returned to his townhouse. The house was silent and still. Ione was not there. A small overnight bag was missing from their closet, as were a few of her most expensive coats. It was all the confirmation he needed. He walked into his study, closed the door, and sat down at his 19th century mahogany desk. It was time to work. He began to assemble his case with the same methodical precision he would use to prepare for a complex surgery. First, he opened the secure folder on his desktop labeled Exhibit A. He printed the screenshot of Ione's Find My Location from the night of the gala, showing her phone pinging from a bar in Dorchester while she claimed to be in Fenway. He printed the log of her communications, highlighting the tally: 47 texts to Malachi in 1 week, 183 in 1 month. Next, he logged into his American Express account. For the next 3 hours, he meticulously went through the last 6 months of statements. Every charge was a clue, a piece of the puzzle. He highlighted the $4,800 charge for the Miraval Berkshire's spa, the trip she claimed to have taken with friends who later denied it. He flagged dozens of exorbitant lunches and dinners at Boston's most expensive restaurants on days he was working 12-hour shifts. He noted the $1,200 Jimmy Choo heels and the $1,900 gown for a gala she likely never attended. He even found a series of smaller, repeated charges, multiple Uber rides to and from the same Dorchester address, week after week. The total of her questionable, unsubstantiated spending over the 6-month period came to a staggering $42,750. He printed every statement and organized them chronologically in a binder. On Saturday, he felt the need for air. He put on his running gear and headed for the Charles River Esplanade. The air was crisp and cold, and his breath plumed in front of him. He ran for an hour, then 90 minutes, his feet pounding a steady rhythm on the pavement, pushing past the pain in his lungs, feeling the burn as a kind of purification. He ran until the anger and the shock were burned away, leaving only a grim, steely resolve. His phone, left behind at the house, had accumulated 17 missed calls from Ione, 5 from Harold, and 3 from Blythe. He had messages, too. He read them with a detached curiosity. Ione, Friday, 9:12 a.m. "Okay, I know you're angry, but you have to understand, Malachi is just complicated. I was going to tell you, this isn't fair. Harold, Friday, 2:30 p.m. Callum, this stonewalling is unproductive. As Ione's father, I demand you speak with her. There are 2 sides to every story. Ione, Saturday, 4:55 p.m. My father said you're not answering. This is ridiculous. You can't just cut me off. I have rights. I'm still your wife." He deleted them all without replying. On Monday morning at 8 a.m. sharp, Callum walked into the offices of Lincoln and Associates, a boutique family law firm in the heart of the financial district. He had made the appointment on Friday from his hotel room. The firm was known for its discretion, its toughness, and its high price tag. His attorney, Ava Lincoln, was a sharp, formidable black woman in her 50s with a reputation for being a shark. Her office, on the 40th floor of a glass tower, had a panoramic view of the city. She billed at $200 an hour. "Mr. Howard," she said, greeting him with a firm handshake. Her voice was warm, but her eyes were all business. "Please have a seat. Tell me what I can do for you." Callum sat down and placed a thick 3-inch binder on her polished desk. "My name is Callum Howard. That," he said, nodding to the binder, "is evidence of my wife's infidelity over the last 6 months. It culminated in a public scene on Thanksgiving Day." He spoke for 15 minutes, his voice calm and even. He laid out the timeline, the discovery of the texts, the location tracking, the financial discrepancies. He described the scene at the Maxwell's home, Ione running out with her ex-boyfriend, and his own quiet departure. Ava listened intently, her fingers steepled. She didn't interrupt once. When he was finished, she opened the binder. She scanned the screenshots, the highlighted credit card statements, the list of addresses. "You have a prenuptial agreement, I assume?" she asked. "Yes," Callum said. "Drafted by Harold Maxwell's own firm, ironically. It clearly states that all premarital assets remain my sole property. That includes my townhouse on Lewisburg Square, valued at $3.2 million, and my retirement accounts, which currently total just over $1.1 million. The agreement provides for no alimony in a marriage of this short duration, especially in a case of proven infidelity." A slow smile spread across Ava Lincoln's face. "Dr. Howard," she said, closing the binder, "you've done most of my work for me. This is not a negotiation. This is a notification." She picked up her phone. "Janet," she said to her assistant, "please begin drafting a divorce petition for Howard vs. Howard, grounds of adultery, and freeze all joint credit accounts effective immediately." Callum felt a wave of relief so profound it almost brought him to his knees. He had taken the chaos and betrayal and forged it into a weapon. The quiet, underestimated man was ready for battle. And he was going to win. The consequences began to cascade on Monday afternoon, just hours after Callum's meeting with Ava Lincoln. At 3:47 p.m., Ione was at a cafe on Newbury Street with 2 friends, trying to spin a frantic, edited version of the Thanksgiving disaster. When the bill for their 3 $18 lattes arrived, she handed the server her black American Express card, the one linked to Callum's account. The server returned a moment later, her expression apologetic. "I'm so sorry, ma'am, but this card has been declined." A hot flush of shame crept up Ione's neck. "That's impossible," she said, her voice louder than she intended. "Try it again." The server did. "I'm sorry," she repeated. "Declined?" Humiliated, Ione had to ask her friend to pay the 54 bill. She spent the rest of the afternoon on the phone with the credit card company, only to be told by a polite but firm representative that the primary account holder had frozen the card. That was the first tremor. The earthquake hit at 7 p.m. that evening. Ione was at her parents' house, pacing the living room and railing against Callum's cruelty when the doorbell chimed. The housekeeper answered it to find a process server standing on the stoop. "For Ione Howard, may around," the man said, holding out a thick envelope. Ione took it, her hands trembling. She tore it open. Inside were the divorce papers. The words leaped off the page. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Grounds, adultery. Attached to it was a formal notice to vacate the property at Lewisburg Square within 30 days, as it was legally designated premarital property under the terms of their prenup. The reality of her situation crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. She had no job. She had no savings of her own. The leased BMW in the driveway was paid for by her father. The designer clothes in her closet were her only assets. She was 36 years old and about to be homeless, entirely dependent on the very parents she had just mortified. Her phone calls to Callum now took on a new frantic energy. The voicemails he received became a real-time log of her emotional collapse. The first was pure rage. Monday, 9:05 p.m. You filed? You actually filed for divorce? Without even talking to me? After everything I did for you, letting you into my family, my world? You are a cold, cruel, heartless man, Callum. You will regret this. The second, arriving a few days later, was tinged with panicked realization. Thursday, 11:22 a.m. I got a letter from your lawyer. 30 days? I have to be out in 30 days? Where am I supposed to go? Callum, this is insane. You can't just throw me out on the street. My things are there. The downfall of her parents, Harold and Blythe, was quieter, but no less devastating. Their world was built on a fragile ecosystem of reputation and perception. The story of their Thanksgiving dinner, whispered from one country club member to another, spread through Beacon Hill society like a virus. The details were just too delicious. The dramatic entrance of the scorned ex-lover, the daughter's panicked flight, and most disturbingly, the surgeon's son-in-law who calmly carved the turkey amidst the wreckage. Harold, who prided himself on his family's impeccable image, was subjected to sly questions and pitying looks at his firm. A junior partner made an ill-advised joke about holiday drama within earshot, and the resulting silence was deafening. He was a man who commanded respect, and now he was the subject of gossip. The humiliation aided him. Blythe canceled her weekly brunch at the Four Seasons for 3 weeks straight, unable to face the sympathetic, yet secretly gleeful faces of her friends. Their carefully curated world had been shattered, not by an outsider, but by the predictable consequences of their own daughter's actions. Meanwhile, Ione's romantic escape plan was also imploding. Malachi, the catalyst for the whole disaster, was a bartender who lived with 3 roommates in a cramped, messy apartment in Alston. His artistic charm quickly faded when faced with the reality of Ione's expectations. He had no money, a mountain of student debt totaling over $40,000, and no interest in supporting a woman accustomed to a lifestyle he could never provide. Within 2 weeks of the Thanksgiving incident, after a series of arguments about money and her refusal to get a job, he stopped answering her calls. The grand passion she had thrown her life away for dissolved into the harsh light of reality. He had wanted a fantasy, not a dependent. A new voicemail arrived on Callum's phone, her voice now stripped of its anger and filled with a raw, pleading desperation. 2 weeks post-filing. Callum, please, I made a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. Malachi is gone. I have nowhere to go. My parents, they look at me with such disappointment. It's a living hell here. Please, just talk to me. We can fix this. Callum listened to the message, his face impassive. He pressed the delete button. There was nothing to fix. He had already excised the disease. The wound was clean. All that was left was for it to heal. The final legal proceedings were swift and brutal. Ava Lincoln presented the binder of evidence. Ione's lawyer, a man paid for by Harold, could do nothing but concede. The prenuptial agreement was ironclad. Ione walked away from the 2-year marriage with what she brought into it: her designer wardrobe, some jewelry, and a future she had never planned for. She was forced to move back into her childhood bedroom in her parents' house, a 36-year-old woman living under the roof of their profound and vocal disappointment. The consequences were not cruel. They were simply the bill for her choices finally coming due. 1 year later, The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the Charles River, turning the water into a shimmering ribbon of light. Callum's feet pounded a steady rhythm against the pavement of the esplanade, his breath coming in strong, even puffs of mist in the crisp November air. He felt a deep, abiding peace in the burn of his muscles and the cold air in his lungs. This run had become his ritual, his therapy, his church. It was where he had processed the grief, shed the anger, and rebuilt himself. His life was quieter now and infinitely more authentic. The $3.2 million Louisburg Square townhouse was no longer a stage for someone else's performance. It was his sanctuary. The sterile white couches were gone, replaced by the worn leather chairs he had always loved. The walls were lined with bookshelves, groaning under the weight of medical texts, history tomes, and novels. The silence that greeted him when he came home from the hospital was no longer lonely. It was peaceful. It was the sound of his own life reclaimed. The divorce had been finalized 10 months ago. As per the prenup, he had kept the townhouse, his premarital retirement accounts, and his equity stake in the surgical practice at Mass General. Ione had faded from his life like a bad dream. He had heard through the grapevine that she was working as a hostess at a high-end restaurant in the seaport, a job her mother had secured for her through a friend. The fall from grace had been swift and complete, but Callum's life had moved in the opposite direction. He had thrown himself back into his work with a renewed sense of purpose. 6 months ago, Kauio Spikes Samspotsibaku, he had been asked to lead a new surgical apprenticeship program at Mass General, designed specifically to mentor promising young surgeons from underrepresented backgrounds. He found a profound fulfillment in it that had been missing from his life. Guiding a young, gifted black woman through her first solo femoral popliteal bypass, seeing the same fire and focus in her eyes that had once burned in his, felt more meaningful than any society gala or expensive dinner ever had. He was building something that would last, investing in people, not possessions. As he rounded a bend near the hatch shell, he saw a familiar figure sitting on a bench, staring out at the water. It was Ione. He almost turned to run in the other direction, but something stopped him. This was the final thread, and it needed to be cut. He slowed to a walk, his heart rate steady. She looked up as he approached, her eyes widening in surprise. She looked smaller. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a simple cloth coat and jeans. Her hair was pulled back in a simple puff, no longer in the elaborate twists she used to favor. There were lines of exhaustion around her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Callum," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Ione," he replied, his tone neutral. He stood a few feet away, giving her space. I see you running here sometimes," she stammered. "You look good, healthy." "I feel good," he said. It was the simple truth. An awkward silence hung between them. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I know it's a year too late," she said, her voice cracking, "but I am so sorry for everything. I was a fool, Callum, a spoiled, selfish fool. I had a good man who loved me, and I threw it all away because I was chasing some stupid high school fantasy. I didn't appreciate you. I didn't appreciate our life." He listened, and for the first time he felt not anger, not betrayal, but a distant clinical pity. He saw her not as the villain of his story, but as a tragic figure in her own, a woman who had been given everything and had understood the value of nothing. "I hope you're happy," she said, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "You deserve to be." He looked out at the river, at the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He thought of his students, of the quiet satisfaction of his work, of the peaceful silence of his home. "I am," he said, and the words were the truest he had ever spoken. He offered her a small final nod. I wish you peace, Ione." He turned and started jogging again, away from her, away from the past. He didn't look back. He felt the last thread sever, clean and final. He realized that true wealth was never about the price tag on a handbag or the address of a townhouse. It wasn't in a $12 million mansion in Beacon Hill or a membership to an exclusive club. True wealth was in the solid foundation of your own character. It was in the work of your hands, the integrity of your word, and the quiet, unshakable peace you build within your own heart. Some people learn that lesson early. Others, like Ione, learn it far too late. And some, he knew, never learn it at all. Every one of us has the power to build our lives on a foundation of rock or sand. Callum's story is a powerful reminder to choose wisely. What do you think is the most important foundation for a happy life? Join the conversation in the comments and let us know your thoughts. And if you found inspiration in Callum's journey to reclaim his peace, please like and subscribe to Love Beyond Pride for more stories of strength and resilience.